yesterday or the day before, 11 people were killed in Israel by the terrorists again.
A terrorist attack?
They're starting
Okay.
again.
Okay.
You know why? Because the parents are getting the money, your tax dollars, for the ISIS to kill the Jews. So we got to
Well.
just pray for that country.
There's a lot of prayer and a lot of need.
11 people were killed on the streets.
11 killed in a terrorist attack. Yeah, Emir Safadi, yeah. I think he's from Israel, isn't he? Yeah. Okay. 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 So so Amir Safadi, that I'm sure you could find YouTube or a search like that. That is a preacher out of Israel, a believer. Okay. 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 All right. Very good. Yes. Well, let's forever keep God's land and God's people and God's will in our prayers. Not that His will happen. We know it's going to happen. But for the process of the Lord's will coming to bear on all of us in the land of Israel. All right. Daniel, tonight we're going to do chapter 7. As I mentioned last week, starting with chapter 7, the book of Daniel switches from a historical focus to a prophetic focus. And one of the things we're going to do as we go through the remainder of the book, each chapter dealing with a vision and a prophecy that Daniel has, is try to put it into the historical context of the book that we've already looked at. So, for chapter 7, we can draw that right from the first verse. Listen to the first verse, Daniel 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dreams. Summarize for me the historical context for this vision we're about to look at tonight. When does it occur? When does he have this experience? First year of King Belshazzar. So are we talking, now we already know from the historical part, Daniel was in Babylon through both a Babylonian reign and a Medo-Persian reign. So which part of that does he have this vision in? Who's in charge? It's the Babylonians. Just barely, okay, because in the 6 chapters we've already looked at, based on what verse 1 says, where do we place historically chapter 7 that we're going to look at tonight? Based on verse 1, where in the preceding 6 chapters do we put this? Well, how does chapter 5 start? Okay, so chapter 5, at the beginning of it, we see the last day of Belshazzar's reign. So where do we put this vision that Daniel has? Before that, is it in chapter 4? Because what's going on in chapter 4? Okay. In chapter 4, we see the end of Daniel's documentation of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. We established before that Belshazzar is a descendant and probably a grandson of that king. So this vision, chapter 7, chronologically would fit between chapter 4 and chapter 5 of the book that, that we've looked at so far. Okay? The scholars put it around the year 553 BC, based on the calculations and that the scholars, and in particular Wiersbe, have been working with. This would put Daniel in his late 60s, under this last Babylonian king, in the beginning of his reign. Daniel has this vision. We're going to see as we look at this vision, and I'm going to mention it now because I want you to get it in your head now. This vision parallels the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. What was that dream? What do you remember about that in chapter 2? Not the tree. That was the other dream. The statue. So we're going to refer back to chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision, dream of a large statue. And what do you remember what was significant about the statue? What was it made of?
Metal. All different types of metal.
Good. It was not a uniform construction. It was specifically 4 different types of metal. Keep that in mind as we unfold Daniel's dream here. We're going to see, again, in summary, before we start, this dream is going to involve a revelation of 6 kingdoms. Okay? Let's start there with question 1. Because we don't normally think in terms of kingdoms. These days, in our modern times, we think of nation states as the political entities by which we identify different countries and their government and their characteristics. So when you hear the word kingdom, what kind of images come to your mind? Castles, knights, Arthur. There's a good one. Many areas that are under one rule. When you think of kingdom, what kind of rule are we talking about? Okay, a monarch, a king, a royalty, perhaps a dictatorship, certainly a more authoritarian type of style of government. Good, okay. Anybody else on the characteristics of kingdom? Because keep in mind, that's how he packages what he sees in this vision. He thinks, because that's what he knows, in terms of kingdoms. So we're going to see 4 of them are kingdoms of this world. One of them is a kingdom of Satan. One of them is a kingdom of the Messiah. Okay. So let's start breaking it down. And we're going to look at it by these kingdoms. That's how Wiersbe breaks down this section of the study. So let's consider first the kingdoms of this world. So consider verses 2 and 3 as Daniel proceeds to tell us about this vision he had. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea." As with prophecies, as with visions that we've seen before, if you remember our study, bless you, of the book of Revelation, so it is with the book of Daniel. A lot of the visionary images, are they literal or figurative? Figurative. They are images representing something else. And we want to strive to understand what the images are representing. So let's start with, in verse 2, the great sea, a restless sea, as he describes. It's being churned up. The winds of heaven churn up a great sea. What is the great sea represent?
Mediterranean?
Not the Mediterranean. The world. The people of the world in its entirety. This is often reference or a figurative reference to the nations of the world in the Bible. Some of the examples we have from Scripture that also use this analogy are the book of Isaiah. You'll find it referenced in chapter 17 and 57 and 60. It's written about in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26. And it's written about in the book of Revelation, chapters 13 and 17. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but if you've already looked at chapter 7, let me ask you, how do we know that in this particular case, the Great Sea is referencing the world? How do we know that? Do we know that for certain? What happens in chapter 7, if you've read it, and I am jumping ahead a little bit, so I'm talking, anybody that has read ahead. What happens starting at verse 15? If you have a study Bible, what does it subtitle this chapter starting at verse 15? The interpretation of the dream. We don't have to speculate. Daniel chapter 7 could be titled Prophecy for Dummies. Daniel asked, and he received, and we're given the interpretation of a lot of the images we have. So if you look at verses 15 through 18, and for this particular study I'm going to be jumping around because of the way the verses relate to one another. 15 through 18 reads, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my head disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there, because what we're going to find is that he's having this dream, this vision, but there are figures that are there while he's, and we presume that, these are angelic beings that are there, and he talks to them. Not unlike, if you remember, if you did this, if we're here for the study of the book of Revelation, the experience that John the Apostle had. Okay? So Daniel says, I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. So here we're given the meaning of the first thing that Daniel tells us about. You have 4 beasts. Well, now we know those are representing 4 kingdoms. And the great sea that the beasts come out of, figuratively, are rising from the earth. Okay? And we'll stop there, actually, for the moment. Go back to the beginning. What's the characteristic of this great sea at the time that Daniel is having this vision? There's a prominent characteristic of this great sea. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm taking you back now to verse 2. The winds of heaven, we'll look at that in a moment, we're churning it up. Is this sea calm? No, it's churned up. It's restless. All right? And where we're going to go with that, or where the vision goes with that, is that as this sea represents the world and the nations, the kingdoms of the world, there's turmoil. The time that Daniel sees, that is revealed to him in this vision, is a time of turmoil. It's a time when the world is socially and morally confused. There is conflict. There are wars. The nature of the world and the nations therein are that it is unpredictable. There's no stability. There's no calm. There's no peace. Everything is in turmoil. Oh, does it sound kind of familiar? Kind of like today are the comments coming up quite a bit, and with very good reason. Okay. The 4 winds of heaven, we are not given as clear of a explanation in the vision. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think, as we look at this, as this unfolds, what do you think the four winds of heaven would be churning up a great sea, that sea being a world in turmoil? What do you think the winds of heaven represent? You say again? Angels. Carrie, I know you want to say something. Ah, okay. God's will. Remember, what's the major theme running through the whole book of Daniel? Is God's sovereignty. Yes, yes. So now we're seeing it applied directly into human affairs, the affairs of the world. The four winds, Wiersbe elaborates, are God's will and God's time, or his timing. And he defends that with a reference to Daniel chapter 4, verse 32, where it refers to, now this is the second dream Nebuchadnezzar had that Ruth had mentioned, starts with the great tree and ends up being figurative for what's going to happen to the man Nebuchadnezzar himself. And in verse 32, as Daniel is interpreting the dream for the king, he tells him, "You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge," and here's the part that Wiersbe uses to interpret or defend the idea of the four winds of heaven being God's will, where he says in 32, "Until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." So we're focusing on kingdoms, specifically in this vision, 4 kingdoms represented by 4 beasts that we're going to look at more closely in a minute. But you have the intervention of God, the intervention of the divine, God exerting his sovereignty, his authority into the lives and the time of humanity, which Daniel sees. And we're going to kind of look at that more as we move through this chapter, exactly what time we're talking about. So we see here in this verse, in verse 2, a contrast with the 4 winds being the sovereignty of God, in contrast to 4 beasts coming up out of humanity into the time of the world. We see God's sovereignty versus human pride. We see nations determined to bring about their own destiny. I will choose my own path by myself, the way I want to go. And we're going to see this conflict played out through this vision that Daniel has. It's a contrast between a human worldview, human emphasizing the fallen nature of man, the fallen nature of the world because of sin, contrasted with a godly worldview, which will not be denied, even in a time of turmoil, that if the people living in the time that Daniel sees, like us in our time, if we're not the people in his prophecy, see so much turmoil in our lives between what God wants and what man demands. A biblical worldview. So as we've seen in the interpretation, the 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms. Kingdoms that come out of the earth. So now we know here we're not talking a supernatural kingdom. This is neither the kingdom of Satan nor the kingdom of Messiah. These are human kingdoms that we look at first. So consider verses 4 through 7 as Daniel describes these 4 beasts. He says the first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle.